I'll unmute it. It's unmuted now.
Okay. And
just talking to it actually.
is there anything I need to do to
No.
transfer them? They're ready.
They should be good. I did show them for the next presenter. Just on the screen, just has to be changed to like your DPI. I'm going to leave it there.
Now everything's set. I don't have any slides.
Oh yeah, you can just talk right to it. His presentation, sorry.
That's it? We have 2 minutes and then we'll go.
Joshi. Come on. Why do they have this one?
All right, we seem to have a full house. I'm going to get ready and get started. So if everyone can grab a seat, there's lots of room up front. No need to hang around in the back. All right, well, welcome to the 2018 Gairdner Symposium at UBC. Before we start with this year's Gairdner Award laureates, it is my pleasure to thank the many sponsors who make this event possible. We have 4 national sponsors that I'd like to thank: the Government of Canada, CIHR, Burroughs Wellcome Fund, and the Globe and Mail. Please join me in thanking our national sponsors. And I've just been told that UBC is the best site at garnering sponsors, and we have 11 local sponsors who help make this happen. And I'd like to run down the list. The Integrated DNA Technologies, IDT, someone we're all very familiar with. Providence Healthcare Research Institute, Merck, the BC Cancer Agency, BC Children's Research Institute, Simon Fraser University, the CDRD, Xenon Pharmaceuticals, the Centre of Excellence for the Prevention of Organ Failure, the University of British Columbia, and last but not least, the Centre for Molecular Medicine and Therapeutics. The Gairdner Awards are turning 60 next year. It's a really remarkable series of awards. Over 380 have now been given out, of which 89 have gone on to win the Nobel Prize. And we're really fortunate today. We have 2 remarkable laureates, and without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker today. It's really been a great pleasure to get to know and to introduce Professor Christopher J.L. Murray. He is currently the director at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation and chair of the Department of Health Metrics at the School of Medicine in the University of Washington. He came to Seattle via Oxford, Harvard, and the WHO, and today is the John Dirks Canada Gairdner Global Award laureate for 2018. He's being recognized for his groundbreaking work in conceptualizing and quantifying the global burden of disease. Doctors Murray and Lopez are co-founders of the Global Burden of Disease study. This is a systemic scientific effort to quantify the comparative magnitude of health loss from all major diseases, injuries, and risk factors by age, sex, location, over time. Starting small in the 1990s, this has grown into a massive effort covering over 300 diseases and injuries across nearly 200 countries, longitudinally from 1990 to the present. This has a massive academic impact. There are over 3,700 collaborators in this effort from 150 nations, contributing to what has been recognized as the world's largest publishing collaboration in science. Not only is it having massive academic impact, but this work has real-world impact, and the Global Burden of Disease study has led to policy changes and improvement in health care delivery in numerous countries around the world, and provides important information to entities such as the WHO, the World Bank, the NIH, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, all of whom use this information just guide their priority setting and spending decisions. The work he's done is making an effort, the efforts he's done is making improvements to all of our help. So please join me in welcoming this year's John Dirks Gairdner Global Award winner, Christopher Murray.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction. And let me try to walk you through the four things I'd like to cover in my presentation, which is, for those of you who are not familiar with GBD, what is it? A little bit of history around this very long-running, 27 years now of the study. Some of the key findings from the current iteration of the burden of disease, and then to talk about what I think is really some of the more exciting work, which is what's new and where are we going with this large collaboration grounded in the quantification of health. So we heard some of it in the intro, which is the GBD. We like to think of it with some key words. We like to think the GBD is systematic. It's an attempt to synthesize all the available data on health and use it to quantify health outcomes. We like to think of it as grounded in good principles of science as opposed to politics. So we are going to not really care so much if governments do or do not like our results. And one of the most important aspects that differentiates what we do in the global burden of disease since its beginning is a focus on comparison, being able to make meaningful comparisons of health over space and time and across communities that are quite different. The underlying premise, and this is one that you have to understand if you're going to follow why and what we do, is that we want decision makers, whether they're local, national, regional, global, need valid, timely, and reliable information on health. And that we should try to provide every decision maker with nearly instantaneous access for free that information grounded on the available data. So that focus on comparability guides a lot of what we try to do. So anybody who's tried to measure things at the population level will have come across a number of problems. We have a slew of inconsistent coding practices and case definition changes. Think of those of you who have ever worked with ICD, International Classification of Disease, coded data. There's the different revisions of the ICD. There are many national variants of the ICD that actually people may not be aware of, even though there's one international standard. Countries choose to modify that. And of course, there's huge variation in case definitions across studies and over time. Think in the published literature, for example, on diabetes, even though WHO uses and recommends a definition of diabetes as fasting plasma glucose above 126 deciliters per gram, there are 22, I believe, definitions in the published literature in use. Just as one very almost minor example of how case definitions vary. Another big problem is that for many of the outcomes we're interested in global health, there are no data in a country in a time period. So if you want comprehensive assessments, you need to have a solution to that. An even bigger problem, analytically, is when we have multiple studies and they have very large differences. So think a very common problem is that there'll be a measurement of an outcome and the prevalence of a disease will be 3% in one study and 9% in another study and 6.5% in the third study. What do you do with seemingly well-conducted but conflicting data? And then another way to think about the studies that are available is that everybody's well-trained in understanding the noise we expect in a measurement by chance, sampling error. But we are less well-trained in all the other things that go wrong or influence measurement, which we can think of as the broad category of non-sampling error. And lastly, in administrative data that many assessments of health count on, some groups get excluded, the poor or the discriminated or certain ethnic minorities in certain countries. And so in the GBD, over the 27 years now of this study, we have developed a series of largely Bayesian statistical methods to try to address these limitations of measurement in a highly standardized way. So we try to correct for change in coding practice and case definition. We deal with this phenomenon of garbage coding, where deaths are assigned to a cause of death that cannot be an underlying cause, that is a more immediate cause, like cardiopulmonary failure. We try to understand statistically the difference in prevalence or incidence that you get from different assays or case definitions, and then map all the measurements that are available to a common metric. And lastly, we use a series of methods that have been largely developed for the GBD to produce estimates for each location, age, sex, year, cause, sequela. And those methods have become possible because of the advent of fast, cheap computing that has made the implementation of Bayesian methods practical when they were always there, but sort of impractical to use for large-scale application. Another aspect of the GBD is that in addition to producing what I would think of as traditional metrics, disease incidence or prevalence, death rates or age-standardized death rates, from the beginning, from the first round of the GBD that in the early 90s, we developed some rolled-up measures that allowed people that wanted the bigger view of health to get it across these very disparate set of outcomes. And so we converted deaths into years of life lost as a measure of premature mortality by taking into account that if you die at a young age, you've lost much more of your lifespan. We took the prevalence of nearly 3,000 clinical outcomes that we estimate, and we, in household surveys, measured the public's view of severity, and then we take the prevalence of each condition times the public's view of severity and add them up, and that's our overall measure of ill health, if you will, called years lived with disability. And we add those two together to create DALYs, one of our apex measures, which you can think of as lost years of healthy life. And we use that same matrix of information to also compute a positive measure, which is how many years can you expect to live in full health or healthy life expectancy. I'll tell you more about where we started in the beginning of the 90s, but today the GBD covers 195 countries. It also includes first administrative level subnational assessments for Brazil, China, Ethiopia, India, and on through the list that you can read. And next week, we'll be publishing the first second administrative level for the UK at the local authority level results. And so that's a very strong direction to increase the geographic granularity of the assessment over time. We now have a comprehensive list of diseases, including groups of diseases, so that every condition has a place in the GBD. We have 359 diseases and injuries. For some, like diabetes, there are many clinical outcomes that we're interested in: retinopathy, neuropathy, diabetes itself. And so in total, we have over 3,000 clinical outcomes that we try to measure. And then for those, we look at 84 risk factors, or groups of risk factors, and quantify the burden related to those risk factors as well. And every year that we produce these assessments, we recompute an entire time series back to 1990 for everything in the GBD. For causes of death, we go back to 1980, and for mortality, fertility, and population, we go back to 1950. And we try to publish the results in scientific journals, and we also make everything we produce available for free online in dynamic data visualizations and increasingly a large number of country-led policy reports. We've had a publishing relationship with The Lancet, and for the last few cycles of the GBD, we've had a dedicated issue that summarizes the high-level findings in 7 or 8 papers in The Lancet. You can see the GBD 2015 on the left in 2016, and GBD 2017 comes out November 10th, which again will be a dedicated issue of the sort of high-level findings. And then depending on disease, risk, or location, many other journals and articles. So that's a very quick run-through of what it is in the GBD. And what I'd like to now go through is some of the evolution of the GBD over time. So in the late 1980s, at the time, there was no coherent source of data on the magnitude of what people died from, let alone what made people sick. If you went to the different WHO programs at the time and asked how many people died from malaria, from diarrhea, from heart disease, from cancer, and added them up, that number exceeded the total number of deaths in the world by several fold. So we knew something was wrong. And there was essentially nothing had been tried on comparable measurement for everything other than death. So lots and lots of gaps in the available data. And in 1991, the World Bank, as part of the process leading up to their first policy report on health, the World Development Report 1993, started the planning work for that study, and they looked around and came to the same conclusion that Alan Lopez, who was at the time at WHO, and myself as an early academic at Harvard had come to, which is there was no coherent source. And fortunately for us, the leader of the World Development Report 1993, Dean Jameson, knew of both Alan and I and asked us if we could answer their question, which is, what is the leading causes of death in the world? And then with some persuasion, what are the leading causes of not just death, but burden of disease, framed as years of healthy life lost? And it took us, we did it, Alan and I working with about 8 research assistants, student research assistants, came up with a first set of results for 1993, and then it took us another 3 years to finalize them. And we published those 2 books shown on the slide in 1996, and then 4 papers in The Lancet in 1997. And that covered 8 regions of the world, so no country estimates, 107 diseases and 10 risk factors. And interestingly, we made forecasts, and more on that towards the end of the presentation. So at the time, not only was it a very small group, but it was a pretty sort of fly-by-night operation. Alan and I did most of the work on the GBD in my house in rural Maine, shown on the left, including being caught that's Alan Lopez shoveling and me with my dog, including getting caught in this blizzard that put 3 feet of snow on us during one of our intensive weeks trying to do the estimates for the GBD. Now, since then, that sort of heroic and effort that was pretty limited in terms of data that were available and methods we could apply, the GBD has grown into a very large collaborative scientific undertaking. And that growth is interesting story in its own right, and I'm going to try to summarize what's happened over the quarter century of the study with 7 key transformations. So back in 1990, if you took 107 diseases by 8 regions of the world, 1 year of estimation for 1990, and for the age groups that we had, we produced 9,360 assessments or estimates of burden. In GBD 2016, the one that was last published, and it'll just goes up for GBD 2017 a little bit, if you take the fact that we now cover many more diseases and injuries, more risk factors, more sequelae, more age groups, quite dramatically so, and geographies, given the subnational assessments, and we now do a complete time series, we produce 400 million units of estimation, age, sex, location, year, and condition. For each of those, there's many different metrics. So the actual volume of things that we're trying to measure is much larger than that. But just some notion of the evolution of granularity. And the big change, as you can see in that table, was around about going from the early cycles of the GBD to when GBD 2010, with the funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that was also related to the creation of the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. Probably more important was shifting from running a small group of people trying to use simple methods to come up with some results to now running a very large collaborative. So we have 3,600 collaborators in 143 countries, and we have 200 people who work full-time on this project in the Institute in Seattle. Now, the advantage of having a large-scale collaboration is that we have many different disciplines represented across the study, from many different traditions, whether clinical medicine or epidemiology or mathematics or statistics, all making some contribution to both the data, the methods, and the interpretation. We also have had to learn how to manage such a large collaboration. When we write a paper, we routinely get 5,000 comments on a manuscript. And I'll tell you, reading 5,000 comments and making sense of them adds weeks to paper writing. It's really quite an elaborate task. And we have a team of about 20 people at IHME whose sole job it is to nurture, foster, respond to the needs of our collaborators. And we've also been asked, because of the use of the GBD, to have quite constant oversight. So there's also, not only do we have an internal governance leadership, in fact, there's one member of our council from UBC in the audience. We have a scientific council that governs the group, but we also have had the collaboration, I should say. The Gates Foundation separately funds an independent advisory committee on the GBD that meets every 6 months as a sort of watchdog over the overall process and provides general guidance on new scientific directions. Third area was the shift from sort of making point estimates that were plausible that we could somewhat defend from the published data to a measurement approach that's grounded in a full statistical theory of measurement, including sampling error, non-sampling error, how do we make estimates, how do we borrow strength over space and time in the estimation process, and to produce uncertainty for every quantity of interest. And to do that, we've had to develop a series of dedicated modeling strategies. So for cause of death, one of the more interesting ones is we developed an ensemble modeling practice. We were very influenced by the Netflix prize. So when Netflix put out the prize for can you better predict what a consumer would like to watch based on their past watching patterns, and there was $1 million prize, lots of labs competed for it. And the interesting thing was the winning entry in the Netflix prize was something that people in meteorology had known for 15 years, which is a blend of good models beats the best model. And so we've internalized that into the GBD, and we have a highly automated system called cause of death ensemble modeling, which looks, the only thing the analyst does is pick what are the possible covariates. It then examines a huge array, essentially every permutation of combinations of models across many families of statistical formulation, and then holds out 30% of the data, fits the models, and then in 15% of the data figures out which models perform best, ranks them, and then the further 15% of the data are used to choose which is the blend of those models that performs best. And so we've tried to leverage these modeling strategies that have emerged in other fields, like ensemble modeling, into the estimation of the burden. The fourth big trend that we've benefited from and contributed to is the trend towards open science. And so we now run the Global Health Data Exchange, which is the largest online data catalog for health data. We have hundreds of thousands of sources, the 108,000 sources that we use for the GBD and many others that are the metadata are in the catalog. And if we are legally allowed, we will share the microdata in the catalog. We also publish all the code that we use for the GBD. And that goes on GitHub. And this is all part of an agreement that the GBD was a key part of with the WHO in creating these transparency guidelines called GATHER, the Guidelines for Accurate and Transparent Health Estimate Reporting. And since 2015, we've been GATHER compliant, and the guidelines only appeared in 2015. Another big trend, and if we had more time, I would illustrate these live, but it's a bit harder in a scientific seminar when I want to cover a lot of terrain to use the online tools. But everything we produce is on a website called healthdata.org, or if you just want to Google GBD compare, you will find our tools. And there you can instantaneously query the entire database that's produced from the GBD. And you can explore it in lots of ways. This is called a tree map, this image. We've translated this into those 6 languages. That's driven in part by our collaborators. We're open to any sort of language, and we can host any language, as long as somebody does the work to translate all the medical terms and all the GBD terms, then we can host that in the tools. That's Norwegian for those of you in the audience who read Norwegian. Why Norway? They've been one of the early adopters at the national level and have actually been helping fund the study as well. As we created a database of highly curated results that is square, i.e. every cell has an estimate, so there's no missing data because we have essentially used these Bayesian tools to impute all the missing data. There are many other applications to this highly curated square database or cubed database. And we've started in the last, I'd say, 3 or 4 years to grow quite substantially the analyses in these new extensions. And I'll give some more later in the presentation. For example, we've added this whole component of trying to use a measure of development called the socio-demographic index to understand what's called the epidemiological transition. What are the predictable changes in health as you go through development? We've started reporting on the health-related SDGs each year in time for the UN General Assembly. With WHO now, we are producing a consensus-based measurement of universal health coverage using healthcare-sensitive outcomes as a way to monitor UHC. Because of the importance of interventions in determining the burden for some vaccine-preventable diseases, we now have very detailed analysis of vaccine coverage. We measure healthcare access and quality. We've added the measurement of human resources for health in this current cycle. And then last September, we published an extension of this work into the economic terrain, taking our education monitoring, health monitoring, putting them together to try to measure human capital across countries. The last of these 7 transitions, which is easy to say but represents an enormous increase in the work of the GBD, is going from periodic, essentially with no time bound, normal academic process. The work is done when the work is done, and you send it off for peer review, to this notion that if we want to provide decision makers with the best available information on a regular basis, we really need to shift to an annual assessment, because it turns out that most decision makers don't want to make decisions on what they view as old data. And so we now recompute the entire time series and make methods changes every year. And what that's done for many outcomes is shifted the focus of policy discussion not to differences in level, but to the pace of progress. What countries are reducing child mortality at 6% per year as opposed to those that are reducing it at 1%. And that's a really important shift in how people view sort of monitoring of health at the population level. Okay, so that was a run-through of sort of what is the GBD and how it's changed over the years. And let me shift to some of the substantive findings. Some of these are unpublished. Some of these are from the papers that will be coming out in November, and some are from last year's papers. This diagram shows from 1950 to present deaths in the world, number of deaths, stacked up by age group, with the red colors being early, late, postneonatal, the oranges, the 1 to 4 and 5 to 9. And then you can see right through the color scheme to deaths in 95 plus, and the sort of dark purple at the bottom. And over the last 70 years, there has been this very dramatic shift towards deaths occurring at much older age. And that reflects largely the huge success we've had in reducing child death rates and much slower declines in death rates in older ages. Most age groups have been going down. There was a period from 1990 to 2000 where death rates in young to middle-aged adults were rising, both because of the mortality crisis in Eastern Europe and the HIV epidemic. But in the long range, death rates have been declining, just at a slower rate at older ages, and then declines in fertility, which have led to a very substantial shift in the mean age or median age of the population. So you get this really dramatic change. And the big spike in the early 60s was the Great Leap Forward in China, which led to mass famine and an excess of about 20 million deaths related to that. Now, here's all the world's data on life expectancy for every country for every year back to 1970 on this diagram. So there's a lot of dots on here, 195 countries, year by year back to 1970. The dots for life expectancy for females on this plot are colored red for the 70s through to blue post-2010. So you can see, the temporal relationships. And on the x-axis is this measure of development called the socio-demographic index, which is really a principal components analysis of, it's not a principal, it's a geometric mean across income per capita, educational attainment, and fertility, which is a more stable measure of development. And you can see the very strong relationship between life expectancy and development. You can see at high levels of development, the dots are more red below the black line and blue above the black line, which speaks to the shift towards higher life expectancies at high levels of development, not at low levels of development, that we've seen over time, controlling for development status. And you can see that at any level of development, there's a pretty big spread. There's probably 10 or 12 years between the best and the worst at any level of development. And so, yes, health is profoundly, or at least mortality is profoundly development related, but there's lots and lots of interesting variation that we would want to understand so that we can move countries from lower, below the black line to above the black line, and insights that can be gained from that. And very likely technology is contributing to shifting higher life expectancy at high levels of development, but not elsewhere. Here's pretty much everything you want to know about mortality by cause, or in this case, actually premature mortality by cause, at the sort of macro level. So what I'm showing here is countries classified by their status today into quintiles of development. Lowest quintile on the far left, highest quintile on the far right. And I'm showing age-standardized rates of premature mortality for 3 large cause groups. So the GBD cause hierarchy is exactly that. It's a hierarchy. So we start at level 1 with communicable maternal, neonatal, and nutritional disorders, all the things that tend to go away as you get richer. The non-communicable causes here shown in blue, and then injuries in green. And what you see is the relationship over time in each square, in each plot, for those 3 broad cause groups, and then the difference between the quintiles across the plots. And despite the HIV epidemic, what you see is that age-standardized death rates over this 1980 to 2016 period have been pretty steadily declining, the red lines. And there's, of course, not only temporal trends, but enormous differences across quintile, even in 2016. For NCDs, the age-standardized rates are going largely down, not up. This is sometimes a surprise to people. And you'll see in a moment where people's thinking about the epidemic of NCDs is coming, but it's not coming here because the age-standardized rates are declining. Now, some diseases are going up, chronic kidney disease, for an example. But in general, as a group, the NCD age-standardized death rates and premature mortality rates are declining, and there's a slow decline in injuries, and you can see the enormous variation. For example, the genocide in Rwanda is the huge spike, the Haiti earthquake, another spike. You can see at low SDI in the injury diagram. So lots and lots here in this one cartoon about the nature of the distribution of health around the world, and I think gives some useful insight on that. Here's the numbers story. And so this is showing you the number of YLLs, years of life lost, as opposed to the age-standardized rate. So I'm adding back in population growth and aging, and that's suddenly where you find that there's an epidemic of NCDs. The number of YLLs is going up very steadily in low, but particularly low, middle, and middle quintiles for NCDs, creating real burdens on healthcare systems in terms of taking care of people with cancer, with heart disease, with chronic respiratory disease, with diabetes, and others. The pattern for years lived with disability is very different. Here's the trend in age-standardized rates. There's almost no trend for NCDs. They're very stable. There's also far greater uncertainty, not because the prevalence of diseases is less well known. In some cases they are, but that's not the big source of uncertainty. The wide uncertainty here is the uncertainty in our actual cardinal value of the disability weights that you measure in population surveys. They're quite consistent in the mean values, but there's a lot of uncertainty in the disability weights, which makes the uncertainty in the YLD rates much larger. And you can see that the communicable maternal, neonatal, and nutritional causes in red go down, but everything else is pretty much flat in terms of disability. And the reason is that the big causes here are musculoskeletal disorders, mental health, ill health, substance abuse, and there's no net trend in those, as well as dementias. Again, there's no net age standardized trend. Numbers exploding, as you might guess, for the same reason we saw for YLLs. Now, you're not going to be able to read this. All I want you to see is the crisscrossing lines. This is down at the much more detailed cause list, and it shows the rank order for women, or for girls and women, of causes of disability-adjusted life years in 1990, in 2007, and 2017. The communicable maternal and neonatal causes in red, NCDs in blue, injuries in green. And there's a tremendous amount of crossing lines reflecting that at the detailed cause level, that large-scale transition that I showed in that first pentatic is reflected at the global level in terms of what are the leading causes, so that by 2017, we have neonatal disorders, ischemic heart disease, and stroke at the top, and then pneumonia and diarrhea. And for men, very similar, except road injuries gets to be in the top 5, and ischemic heart disease is number 1. And there's lots of, fascinating things going on at the detailed cause level, such as the rise of diabetes, back pain, cirrhosis, lung cancer, all driven by both exposure as well as by aging. Now, we affectionately call this diagram our Georgia O'Keeffe diagram. And despite the bright colors, what it's trying to do is use the whole GBD database and put into one picture this phenomenon that people think of as the epidemiological transition, which is what is the average change in the profile of disease as countries on average go through development. And so development on this diagram is going from, on the y-axis, from the bottom, least developed, to most developed at the top. And we're showing you the predicted or expected value for each cluster of diseases, both for premature mortality, YLLs on the left, and YLDs, the years lost due to diseases, morbidity, on the right. And down at a very low level of development, the profile of disease, both because of demography and epidemiology, is dominated by the red category, which is diarrhea, pneumonia, and other infectious diseases, a little bit the neglected tropical diseases in orange, and then neonatal disorders in yellow. And as you transition through to, let's say, middle levels of development, you get to a point where those have declined very substantially, and you start to see purple, cardiovascular disease. You start to see neoplasms in dark green becoming much more important on the YLL side. And on the YLD side, because the rates for musculoskeletal disorders, mental health, substance abuse don't change very much through development, you get the pattern quite constant, and then because of aging, it actually starts to grow. So you get more YLD rates, not age standardized on this diagram, so that by the time you get up to the highest level of development, you get a profile where half the burden is YLDs, half is premature mortality, and the premature mortality that remains is mostly heart disease and cancer, with a growing contribution from diabetes. So there's a tremendous amount of everything we know about the epidemiological transformation in this one diagram. We can use the burden of disease also to look at the ratio of observed to expected burden. And this is, again, removing the effect of development and saying who's an outlier. And what's interesting here, these aren't the places in red with the highest burden. It's the highest relative to what you'd expect. And that's where you find, for example, states in the United States do rather poorly compared to here in Canada, as an example. We also do risk factors in the GBD, and at the global level, for risk factors, child and maternal malnutrition is at the top, then diet, then high blood pressure, then tobacco, and then air pollution. And you can on down with the metabolic risks, then interspersed with a number of other factors. People often think that poor water is the biggest determinant of health in the world, and if you went back 25 years, it's towards the top. It's in the top 5, but it is way down the list because very marked progress that's development associated with poor water. Now, I only show this diagram, which is size of risk factor versus trend, just to point out the one big green dot on the top right, which is high body mass index. It's the one large risk factor that is increasing quite substantially. And so if we look across the totality of risk factors in the burden of disease, there's lots of big risk factors, blood pressure, tobacco, alcohol, but only high body mass index is really rapidly getting worse. And it's dragging with it the second green dot, which is fasting plasma glucose. So special warning for the potential burden from high body mass index. And as I mentioned, you can go and get all the details from the GBD on this website. Now, what I'd like to talk about in the last few minutes is where's the GBD going and some of the new directions. And there's lots. You can imagine with a collaboration of 3,600 people that people have lots and lots of ideas. And I'm just going to touch on 5 that are sort of particularly, I think, salient today. So for GBD 2017, we've added our own systematic analysis of population and fertility. Turns out that in all previous iterations of the global burden of disease, we had used the UN Population Division's estimates of population by age and sex and year. And those were problematic for us because they actually only make estimates every 5 years, and then you have to interpolate between them. And more importantly, their estimates of population were not consistent with our estimates of mortality. Because in between censuses, sometimes that are quite far apart, you have to estimate population taking into account your estimates of migration, fertility, and death rates. And so to deal with this inconsistency, we did what I think of as the standard GBD practice of a systematic analysis, where we identified all the known censuses. We were able to obtain all but 60 of them. Those 60, we don't know if the numbers were ever published. We can't find evidence of them being published. We know they were conducted. But we were able to find 1,257 census counts, 761 population registry years in 26 countries, did a series of what many would think of standard demographic tasks to deal with measurement error of age, things like age heaping, under enumeration in censuses. And then we developed a Bayesian estimation model that looks sort of like this, where this is the data for Indonesia. The dots are the census counts. Our estimate, and of course this is done by age and sex. I'm just showing you males on the left, females on the right for all ages combined. The Bayesian model with uncertainty fit to the data, including the inputs, which are around fertility, mortality, and migration. The green dashed line is the population that should be present in Indonesia if there were zero migration. It's just a reference point that tells you there's net emigration, as you know, from Indonesia. What's interesting about the population analysis is, at the global level, we agree with what the UN has said, about 7.6 billion people. But at the country level, our numbers differ by as much as 20%. And so we know less about population than I think any of us expected to say. And of course, since population goes into the calculation of every conceivable rate in every analysis, a 10% difference, which is the case for Nigeria, really makes a big difference for all the analyses that people might do. So it really does matter a lot. The other thing that comes from our population analysis, which again is perhaps better known for many than others, is just how far in the transition to low fertility many countries in the world are. So we've passed the point where half the countries in the world are below replacement fertility. That doesn't mean that they're declining. If you look at this map of population growth in the last 8 years, only those countries in red through to light orange, the population is actually declining, or those subnational units. But all the rest of the countries with below replacement fertility, within a generation, population will be declining. So at the global level, we forecast that the world will be below replacement fertility in sometime in the decade of the 2030s. So we're living in a world where there's still rapid population growth, 2% plus per year in sub-Saharan Africa in the blue countries. But for the rest of the world, a bigger issue is going to be declining population. And how do countries manage that tension between more open migration policy versus trying to manage declining populations? And this is a reality in a place like Estonia, where their population decline is 30% in the last 20 years. So a very real problem that's coming up on us. Now, I think one of the more exciting developments for us is the publication last week of our future health scenarios in the Lancet. This was a long time coming. Alan and I, in the first 4 GBD papers in 1997, made some very simple forecasts using a very simple model, linear model with 3 independent variables: income, education, and tobacco. And we forecasted our 107 causes in GBD 1990. Now, in the modern era, people's expectations for forecasts are much higher. You need to demonstrate forecast performance. How good are you at predicting in the forecast future? And people would like, and this is what took us a number of years to build, would like to use models for 2 purposes. One is, say, statistically what's most likely to occur in the near to mid-future for planning purposes. And at the same time, can you tell me alternative scenarios? How do I bend the arc of the future by tackling key drivers, whether it's tobacco or immunization or some other risk or intervention? And it turns out it's very hard to have decent forecast performance out of sample and have a causal model. In fact, economists generally have given up on causal models for making economic forecasts because they perform so poorly. And in the demographic world, they just do the purely ARIMA sort of, time autocorrelation type models to forecast. But for the scenario purposes, we want to do both. And we've been able to develop a model that has 3 components that allows us to have good forecast performance, as good as that's been published just with time as the driver on the right-hand side, but allows us to have a causal framework where we can do essentially a myriad number of alternative scenarios. We've published a better scenario and a worse scenario. Here's some flavor of that. So top right is fertility. The blue line is that's the total fertility rate for the world. The blue line is what's statistically most likely to occur. That's where you get the 2035 crossing of 2.05, the replacement. The red line is the worst scenario. That's what happens if there's slower economic growth, slower progress on education, and slower improvement of reproductive health services. And the green line is the reverse, the better scenario. Middle right panel is what happens to life expectancy at the global level. We see, even in the reference scenario, a slowdown for life expectancy, in part because of obesity, but also because in middle and high-income countries, the big driver of life expectancy gain, which was heart disease, declines. There's only so much room left. If you've already reduced heart disease down to a smaller fraction, it can have only a smaller effect on total mortality. But between the green and the red line, there's an 8-year span of life expectancy in 2040, meaning that within reasonable ranges of those independent drivers, tobacco, alcohol, diet, water, sanitation, etc., it can make a huge difference to the trajectory of life expectancy. And then on the left panel here is the population pyramid, showing how what happens to fertility in the better scenario, the green line, which would be many fewer kids, will concomitantly lead to more people living to older age, meaning the variation across scenarios is smaller than you might expect for population on the bottom right. Lots and lots of country-specific detail in this. We see the forecasting as a nice segue from the description of the past and the present, which is what the GBD is, into a more policy-oriented tool where decision makers can ask explicit, alternative scenario questions to help inform decision making. Interesting things on the epi transition. These are called ternary plots, which show the three causes on the three vertices of a triangle. And so the distance from the base tells you the fraction of the burden in each region that's from a cause group. Injuries on the bottom right, infection, communicable maternal neonatal on the bottom left, and NCDs on the top. And there is this trajectory over time, both in the past and forecasted in the reference scenario, out to have ever larger shares of the burden due to NCDs. But notice the bottom right, that even in 2040, we expect half the burden of disease to still be from communicable maternal and neonatal causes, given current trends and drivers. So if we want to see the epi transition really shift in sub-Saharan Africa, faster progress is going to be necessary. The biggest risks determining the future are demonstrated here. The width from left to right is the difference between better and worse related to different risk factors. And the biggest determinant of the difference between better and worse is high blood pressure, high body mass index, high blood sugar, tobacco, and alcohol, and air pollution coming in sixth. And those six together account for a really important fraction of that difference between better and worse. Let me end on single slides on a couple of other areas that the GBD we're trying to work on. This one is a tricky one, which is we have 84 risk factors. We have 481 risk outcome pairs. So think processed meat and diabetes as a risk outcome pair. And for supporting the relative risks we use in the GBD for those 481 risk outcome pairs are 2,330 studies, 216 of which are trials, 857 are prospective cohorts. And then for some rare outcomes, we've had to use case control studies, but we use them with great care. And that's the evidence base for the relationship between risk and outcome. But not all risk outcome pairs are equal. The evidence for tobacco and lung cancer is certainly stronger than the evidence for vegetables and heart disease. And so we've been asked, and are trying hard, to think of ways in which we can put the assessment, which we currently use the World Cancer Research Agency criteria, which are quite subjective, plausible or convincing evidence. You know, it's clearly written out, but you can't write a mathematical algorithm or a computational algorithm that will spit out the answer, is it plausible or convincing, because nobody's actually written the detail down to do that. And if you can't pass that test, there's still a operator dependence in that judgment. And what we're seeking is to try to develop such an algorithm. It's work in progress. It takes us into this terrain which gets into lots of controversy about when is the evidence sufficiently convincing that you actually would act on it or use it. And then you find out that some areas the evidence is far weaker than people are happy about. We expect to have this ready for GBD 2019 as it's work in progress. Another area that we've just been launching with support from the UK government, from Wellcome Trust and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is adding the burden of antimicrobial resistance to the GBD. And for us to do that, we have to do two things. We have to elaborate the matrix of causes in the GBD with all the pathogens that contribute to those causes. We have to, and we've already done this, quantify the burden of sepsis in people who die from a non-communicable cause, but the pathway to death with sepsis. So that should be coming out early next year, we hope. And then for each of those pathogens, we have to look at the available data from labs on the prevalence of antimicrobial resistance. And then lastly, we need to know the excess mortality that's caused by resistance. The presence of resistance doesn't mean that a death in that patient is due to the resistance. You need to compare them to somebody with a drug-sensitive bug. And it turns out that for many of the published studies, there isn't much excess risk. For some, there are. And so that'll be an important area. So it's just an example of where we are responding to people's request for better quantification of what's become a policy-relevant outcome. And my last slide is a purely methods-related slide, and that has to do with one of our Bayesian tools, which is the simultaneous estimation of incidence, remission, and excess mortality using all the available data on disease incidence, disease prevalence, duration, and cause of death information. And that joint likelihood estimation is in a framework that allows for both covariates with fixed effects on those covariates and random effects, spatial random effects. And the new development, we have a very smart mathematician, Brad Bell, who has figured out a way to make the random effects in this model vary over age and time on an age-time grid. And that shift, and there's many other improvements in this Bayesian meta-regression tool, and we expect to figure out the software implementation and speed issues related to that by next year. And then, of course, when it's available, we'll make it as a publicly available tool for other people to run their analyses. So that's a flavor of some of the directions. The reason I wanted to talk about some of these new directions is we see the GBD collaboration as a dynamic scientific enterprise where, whenever people critique us, which is very often, we try to absorb those critiques and figure out directions for both improving the data, improving the methods, and improving the various applications that are possible. Thanks for your attention. So we have time for a few questions, I think.
Perfect timing. You're right on time. Please use the microphones if you have any questions.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for this. It was absolutely fascinating. I wanted to get a little bit more information on how you obtain the data around disability or that measure, especially if you look at any patient-reported outcomes or take that into consideration.
So the disability part has two components. The prevalence of a particular sequela, whether that is major depression or, retinopathy, and then people's judgment of how severe it is to have that sequela. So the judgment part, the health state weights, come from population-based surveys that have now been conducted in about 16 countries. What's interesting in the judgment part is that there is no clear relationship with education or location, which is a surprise to people. And I think partly because the thing that we're asking people is about health and not about well-being. So we're very explicitly have a framework that we're trying to measure health. We're not trying to measure people's total well-being. And when you ask people about is state A healthier than state B or vice versa, we get remarkable consistency from rural Tanzania to the United States, which is helpful.
Beautiful talk. My question is about the credibility of the raw data coming from many places in the world. How credible it is that government will release and share it with you? How can you judge it? How can you give a ranking to the credibility? Or do you have ways to go through that?
Great question, and one that everyone always appropriately asks. So just to put in context, GBD 2017, we used, for the current cycle, 108,000 data sources, where the vital statistics of Canada for a year would be a source, or a household survey would be a source, or a cohort study would be a source. For each of those, we do go through some algorithm to assess quality. So for all the cause of death data, as an example, there's a suite of tools that were developed starting in the 70s to measure completeness. Right? They're called death distribution methods. So the first step there is to evaluate the completeness, and then if they're incomplete, as long as they don't drop below a bar, which from memory it's 60% completeness, we will correct up to as if they were 100%. If it drops below the bar, we just have to discard the data. Second step on cause of death data is there is this phenomenon called garbage coding, I briefly mentioned at the beginning, where physicians will write things that aren't underlying cause, like cardiopulmonary arrest, which tells you nothing about the disease pathology that led to death. And so then we also have criteria that say if there's too much garbage coding, we will not use the data. And if for what garbage coding there is, we have a whole set of algorithms to try to probabilistically predict what the actual underlying cause would be in a 63-year-old man with cardiopulmonary arrest in that country. And it's its own sort of interesting area. One which I think as more and more people use the GBD, we're getting more and more interesting, groups doing research on, comparing to autopsy, comparing to other types of sources. Can we get better redistribution algorithms? The last part of your question is about frank, manipulation of data. And I think it's really interesting. It's really hard to manipulate data in a way that isn't really obvious. There was a period, for example, where some countries decided that their country was so wonderful that nobody could possibly commit suicide. So there were no suicides. Well, that's a pretty crude way of manipulating data, which then immediately gets identified and gets tossed out. There's also patterns in data. So if you have access to, the more disaggregated the data, the more you can run these tests. How many times different digits have to show up in truly generated data versus manipulated data. And it's quite hard to make up data that will pass all the logical tests that people can think of. I'm sure it does occur, but I think it's really hard to do. You have to be really clever.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about the 2040 forecasting models.
Sure.
Because obviously you guys look a lot at health data, but to what extent have you or are you able to account for projections based on things like climate change and global food security when you're making these estimations?
So a great question, and one that we spend quite a bit of time talking about in the discussion of the paper. So what these forecasts include are all the risk factors and income per capita, education, fertility, and select interventions, vaccination for children, antiretroviral therapy for HIV, for which the quantification of the GBD is quite far along. And we run those into the future, and then those become some of the control knobs that you can adjust for the scenarios. What we don't have is explicitly climate change or AMR or flu pandemics. So there are three things that could be very important for the trajectory. But we have a plan on climate, which is first to include in the GBD in the next cycle temperature as a risk. And then it'll be easy enough to use the IPCC forecasts of temperature, although they don't have a single forecast, they just have different scenarios, but we can use some other groups' probability weightings of those to include temperature into the model. And then the other trickier, then there's this extreme weather events. There's separate efforts that have been undertaken to try to get a handle on that. The harder part there is the health effects mediated through decreased agricultural yields in water-stressed rural areas at risk, and then leading to lower household income and then all the consequences that we might expect around health. That's the trickiest one for us. We haven't found a credible way to quantitatively model it. And even further complication is that the first part, the pure temperature part, is not in the direction that we expected. If you look at all the data that's out there on temperature, turns out it's a very U-shaped curve on temperature. So cold is bad and heat is bad. And if you just the way all the numbers work out, the net benefit will be greater from reducing deaths from cold than the increase of deaths from heat. Obviously not true country by country, but globally that turns out to be the case. Meaning that until we can figure out how to model the other pathway through rural impoverishment, it would be a very misleading thing to add to the forecasts. AMR, same thing, we will try to add it. That's a bit more complicated because we have to first quantify AMR today and then forecast into the future. And then on flu, we've had one really large pandemic 100 years ago. And so, nobody can come up with anything better than saying one chance in 100 of a really bad thing every year. So it's very inadequate so far.
Time for one more question.
Is this working? Okay. Yeah, so over the nearly 30 years you've been doing these analyses, what has been the biggest surprise that you've come upon?
Goodness. One of the biggest surprises in the 90s when we first started was, which certainly was not what either Alan or I expected to see, was the large burden from mental health. So almost unwittingly, by framing our metric around healthy years of life, and then going and asking people what are the severities that go into that, we ended up quantifying that there was a tremendous amount of burden due to depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, et cetera. And that finding was certainly not what we were setting out to look for and caught us by surprise. It caught the world by surprise and then triggered the World Health Organization, taking mental health more seriously as an example. It then became the sort of de facto parity. We had built in what the mental health community had been asking for a long time. We had sort of, without knowing, we had built into the GBD this notion of physical and mental health parity because we were in the same metric. And that has turned out to be a big impetus for the mental health community. We had a similar phenomenon in GBD 2010 where the data got better on musculoskeletal disorders. And it turns out back pain, things like that are highly prevalent and highly disabling in the severe end of the spectrum. So huge unmoving burden from musculoskeletal disorders. Again, with reflection, it makes sense. Everyone I've ever met has somebody in their family that is afflicted. And then the last one, I think the big surprise to us has been the likely, and I have to put the stress on the word likely, as best we can tell from the evidence, very important role of diet. And I modify it with the word likely because once we have the evidence grading score, I think many of the diet findings will be 1-star or 2-star findings, not 5-star findings in terms of the strength of evidence, partly to do with just how few cohorts there are in diverse settings on diet. But very likely in aggregate true, and that there's a very large burden, because otherwise we can't really explain the geographic variation in cardiovascular disease. You can't explain it by tobacco, alcohol, blood pressure. There's too much of it. So diet likely very important. Surprised us that it was towards the top on the risk factor assessments. So 3 surprises. Thanks.
Thank you again.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Louis Lefebvre. I'm from the Department of Medical Genetics, and it's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce our second speaker today, my former mentor, Professor Azim Surani. Azim obtained his PhD in 1975 from the Department of Physiology at the University of Cambridge, where his PhD thesis work was supervised by the Nobel laureate, Robert Edwards, who developed the in vitro fertilization technology. From 1979 to 1991, he led his own research group, first at the Animal Research Unit and then at the Babraham Institute outside of Cambridge. And it's during this time that he published a series of seminal developmental studies that led to the discovery of genomic imprinting. And I think this was important because it basically brought about the emergence of epigenetics as an important field of research in mammals. Since 1992, he is the Marshall Walton Professor at the Wellcome Trust Cancer Research UK Gairdner Institute at the University of Cambridge, where he is the Director of Germline and Epigenomics Research since 2013. While at the Gairdner Institute, what's been amazing is that his research group has been at the forefront of research in the epigenetics field, and they've made a series of key contributions to stem cell biology, germ cell biology, our understanding of pluripotency, as well as concepts such as epigenetic reprogramming. He was awarded the Gairdner Medal, from the Royal Society in 2001. The Royal Medal in 2010. He also gave the prestigious Mendel Lectures in the Czech Republic, also in 2010. He is a Commander of the British Empire, a Fellow of the Royal Society, and a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences. Together with Davor Solter from the Max Planck Institute of Immunobiology and Epigenetics, he is the laureate of the 2018 Canada Gairdner International Award for his discovery of genomic imprinting. So please join me in welcoming and congratulating Professor Azim Surani.
Can you hear me?
Try to see if we can activate it on the control, maybe.
Right. Thank you very much. No, you can hear me. Okay. Thanks a lot, Louis, for the nice comments. So I'm going to change the topic of this my talk. I'm a developmental biologist. I'm actually going to tell you very briefly about genomic imprinting. This is work we did some years ago. And of course, the work has evolved. So I will give you a brief summary of genomic imprinting. And I would then like to tell you a little bit more about the work that we have done subsequently on the mouse germline, and more recently we've been working on the human germline. So I actually started my research almost around the time that I was doing my PhD. And the question that we were asking was quite simple. And the question was, are both parental genomes essential for mammalian development? So that was the question that we started with. The answer turned out to be more interesting than you might think. So we know from Mendel's work that parental genomes are genetically equivalent. And we also know that some vertebrates can reproduce asexually. There are lizards, fish, and frogs can reproduce asexually. So there's no need for paternal contribution. So the early work that we were doing was to try and find out whether this could be the case in mammals as well. And at the time, there was a lot of controversy about the subject. There were a couple of unfortunate fake papers in the field that put us back. So in the end, what we did was this experiment that was done also independently by Davor Solter, which actually told us that in mammals, you do require both parental genomes for development. And the reason is that they are functionally non-equivalent. And this conclusion came from this experiment where we combined either two paternal genomes on the left-hand side or two maternal genomes. And we found that you couldn't get development of these embryos. But more importantly, what was interesting was that the conceptuses that we obtained had the opposite phenotype. So generally, the embryos with the two maternal genomes had better embryos, and those with two paternal genomes had better placenta or trophoblast. So this actually suggested that there must be some genes that function depending on their parental origin. The function was dependent on their parental origin. And during subsequent work that was done, it indeed turned out that there are some genes that its function, whose expression is strictly dependent on whether they come from the mother or the father. And here's a list of 150 such genes. These are the canonical imprinted genes. There might be more, and there might be more in humans. Some people think that there might be more in humans. But these are the ones that we know about that show difference in expression depending on whether they come from the mother or father. So one of the examples you see here is that, for example, the insulin-like growth factor 2, which is a very major growth factor for fetal development, its expression is dependent on the paternal origin. So the maternal copy is silent. And so there are these groups of genes that function depending on whether they come from the mother or the father. There are very similar sorts of genes that are also been found to be imprinted in humans as well. So this phenomenon is, although most of the work has been done in mice, we can also see that the similar genes are present in humans as well. And there are various ways of thinking about these groups of genes. One way of thinking about it is that there is some kind of a network of these imprinted genes, as some people have suggested. And they have a function in a variety of mammalian aspects of development physiologies. For example, in balancing growth and development, mammalian physiology, placentation, metabolism. So they don't have a particular function. They have a variety of functions, particularly in regulating mammalian development and physiology. Just to give you an example, one of the genes that was looked at was by Louis Lefebvre, who's sitting here in front of me. This was one of the early genes that we had discovered called MEST or PEG1. And looking at the loss of function, so this is only expressed when it comes from the father. And the loss of function of this particular gene has a maternal behavior effect. So these mice, I think this result is still largely true, I think, Louis, that these mice which have loss of function of this gene, the mothers actually show abnormal maternal behavior. Usually they show stereotypical behavior like nest building and so on. These mice don't show that. So this is just one example amongst the 150 genes that were isolated. There was more recently, so you can disrupt this network of imprinted genes in a variety of different ways. And there's another example from more recent work by alumnus of this university, Andrew Pospisilek, had a small part in this study. And what this study showed was that if you have a mutation in TRIM28, which is a gene which is involved in the repression phenomenon, loss of function of this particular gene in isogenic mice, so these are mice which are genetically very similar, this seems to disrupt the imprinted gene network. So that what although these are genetically very similar, what happens is there is a small proportion of these mice that become obese. And this is partly to do with the disruption of particularly two genes, PEG3 and neuronatin, which are the two genes that we had worked on. So this shows that there are other ways in which you can disrupt this imprinting network, which have consequences. And then further studies that Andrew did suggested that similar disruption of TRIM28 also results in obesity in children as well. So there are probably a number of other diseases which don't have a particular name, but if other mutations which if they cause a change in the imprinting network will lead to human diseases. So I can summarize the impact of the discovery of genomic imprinting in this way, that imprinting is inheritance of epigenetic parental imprints which persists into adulthood, so that you acquire these imprints in the parental germlines, and these imprints then persist throughout adulthood. Because of this imprinting, the parental genomes exhibit functional differences during development. This explains why in mammals you require both parental genomes. You cannot get development, for example, of parthenogenetic embryos. Seems that from a number of studies that imprinted genes in mammals regulate development and mammalian physiology. And I think one of the key impact of this discovery was that it has impacted in the field of epigenetics, which are the tags on top of the DNA which regulate expression of genes. And this field of research has been found to be extremely important in a number of human diseases like cancer. And there are some well-known diseases like Prader-Willi syndrome and so on, which are caused by defects in imprinting. So from this work that we did on imprinting initially, we then actually started to think about the mammalian germline, because all of the mechanisms involved in the imprinting phenomenon actually take place in the germline. So this is what we started to do. And this is a picture of, this is the slide which shows you the germline and imprinting cycle. So we know, I've told you that we acquire some information from the germline in the form of imprints from the parental germlines. So if we now follow this cycle, we can see that the germ cells are actually specified very early in development. They are specified during early post-implantation development. In mice, this occurs on day 6.25. In humans, probably around day 17 or 18. So after specification, they migrate towards the developing gonads. And during this period, there is a very important epigenetic resetting, epigenetic programming of the germline, where the imprints are erased. And we think that it's also possible that the epigenetic clock might be reset here. And this concept of the epigenetic clock has been proposed by Howard. And what he has found is that as you get older, you acquire methylation imprints in your various tissues. And you can determine your epigenetic clock versus your chronological age. And if your epigenetic clock is advancing faster than your chronological age, it means that you're aging faster than you should be. So this is an area which Howard and other people are exploring with the view of understanding the aging process. But we think that the clock gets reset around this point. And the imprints actually themselves are then reestablished in sperm and oocyte. And we also have some interest in some of the other information that's transmitted by the germline. So most of the DNA that is transmitted by the germline is in the form of repetitive sequences. 75% of what is transmitted from one generation to another is repetitive sequence. And we are particularly interested in the hominoid-specific repetitive sequences for a variety of reasons, which I'll tell you about. So the first thing that we started to explore around the year 2000 was to try and understand how the germ cells are specified. Particularly, we started working on the mouse germ cell specification. And when we started, what was known was something about the origin of the primordial germ cells in the mouse embryo, which comes from this proximal epiblast cells, which was based on clonal analysis carried out by Lawson and colleagues. And what was found was that during this period of development to day 7.5, the founder population of primordial germ cells are established. So you have approximately 30-odd primordial germ cells in day 7.5 embryos. Now, at the time when we started doing this work, there was nothing known about the genetic basis for germ cell specification. Most of the study that was done told us about some of the signaling that was involved and broadly, where these germ cells originated. So we started to address this problem using this particular approach. And what we did basically was to take this fragment out containing 30 cells, about 300 cells, with 30 cells within them, which were the primordial germ cells. And basically what we did was to make single-cell cDNAs from this, and then did a classical single-cell cDNA screen to look for genes that we hope were important and essential for germ cell specification. So this was the original screen that was done, and we had 83 single-cell cDNAs. And we did this screen. This is all published, it's old work. And this screen actually, despite the negative comments we had from reviewers of my Wellcome Trust grant, the grant was funded in the end, but we found a number of these genes. And one of the most important genes was this gene BLIMP1, which is the key regulators of mouse germ cell specification. So moving forward rapidly, in the end, what was found by us and many other colleagues who were working in this field is that you require 3 genes. There are 3 key genes that are required for the specification of mouse primordial germ cells, which are BLIMP1, PRDM14, and AP2 gamma. And what these 3 genes do is they have 3 functions. The first is that they repress the somatic program, they repress the somatic genes. They upregulate the program for germ cell specification. And the third important function they have is they initiate the epigenetic program that I talked about. So the epigenetic program that is initiated is very intimately linked with the specification of primordial germ cells. So this was really quite a central discovery that was work done by many groups, and we contributed to that. And this has led to some really quite spectacular advances in the understanding of the mammalian germ cell lineage. And amongst this is the demonstration by some of my former colleagues that it is in fact possible to take your skin cells, reprogram them, and to make artificial gametes, viable artificial gametes. It is quite amazing to think that you can take skin cells and convert them into functional gametes. And this kind of breaks Weizmann's barrier. So Weizmann was a pioneer in the germ cell field, and he suggested that there are two types of cells, the somatic cells which perish with each generation, and the primordial germ cells which give rise to the next generation. But this demonstrates that it's possible to take somatic cells and convert them into primordial germ cells, which is quite a profound change in the way we think about germ cell lineage. The other key outcome from this work, we think, was the development of the technology of single-cell analysis. So following on from this work, we collaborated with Kai-Tin Lau from Applied Biosystems. And we did the very first experiment on taking single-cell and getting single-cell transcriptome from that. And there's been an amazing subsequent development of this technology, which is one of the most rapidly growing technologies. And there have been lots of other additional advances that have been added to that, to this technology. And it has contributed greatly to our understanding of heterogeneity amongst seemingly homogeneous populations of cells. And one of the big programs which is underway is this idea of creating human cell atlas, which is the idea is to sequence every single cell in the human body and create a human cell atlas. This is a big effort that is underway, and many organizations are contributing to this. So returning to the subject of specification and epigenetic programming. So as I told you, the specification of the primordial germ cells is then followed by epigenetic reprogramming, which involves DNA demethylation, erasure of imprints, and in female embryos, X reactivation. I'm not going to go through all the data, but just to give you one example. So amongst the three factors that I told you about, two of these factors, BLIMP1 and PIDM14, are really the key to the initiation of the epigenetic program. And the way these factors work is that they will repress some of the genes that are involved in DNA methylation and will induce expression of some of the demethylases which are involved in removing some of the epigenetic marks. So one of the key epigenetic marks that is erased very early on is this mark, histone H3 lysine dimethylation mark. And this is kind of a prerequisite to the initiation of DNA demethylation. And these are the two genes which actually promote this particular program. The second thing that is important is the repression of a gene called UHRF1. UHRF1 is very important for the maintenance of DNA methylation because it tethers the maintenance methylase to the DNA for the maintenance of DNA methylation by DNMT1, DNA methylation, DNMT1. And in the absence of UHRF1, you don't get this tethering of this particular enzyme. So what happens when you repress UHRF1, you get replication dilution of DNA methylation, so you get gradual loss of DNA methylation. And this is also responsible for the erasure of imprints. There's also the involvement of TET enzymes. The TET enzymes are involved in the conversion of 5-methylcytosine to 5-hydroxymethylcytosine. And the theta enzymes are upregulated, and what they do is they convert 5-methylcytosine to 5-hydroxymethylcytosine. You can see this in this particular example where this is one gene called DAZO, which undergoes DNA demethylation. This is bisulfite data, sequencing data, where you can see that there's loss of DNA, 5-methylcytosine. And what happens is that there is this loss of DNA methylation from this particular gene, but there is this transient increase in 5-hydroxymethylcytosine, and subsequently you get this loss of 5-hydroxymethylcytosine as well. So to summarize this, I won't go into all the detail, but what is important is that there isn't a single mechanism that is involved in this global DNA demethylation. There are parallel redundant mechanisms that are operating, and that also includes base excision repair. There's some evidence for base excision repair as well. So many of these mechanisms are working together to induce loss of DNA methylation. And this is part of the resetting process of the epigenome before it is passed on to the next generation. And this DNA demethylation will also take out some of the aberrant DNA methylation marks that might be present in this at this time. So we know quite a lot about the mouse germ cell lineage, how it's specified, how it's reprogrammed. So the question is, why would you want to look at the human germ cell lineage? And the reason is that there's increasing evidence that there are many differences in molecular differences between mouse and human. For example, in the way the pluripotency network is regulated. Although these embryos look very similar, there are molecular differences in the way the pluripotency network actually operates. The second difference, which is obvious, is that the rodent embryos form an egg cylinder, whereas human embryos form these kinds of bilaminar discs. And in fact, most of the mammalian embryos don't look like these embryos. They look actually like bilaminar discs. Now, there's a particular problem when you want to study human embryos, because there are technical challenges and also there are ethical concerns, because these embryos are not really accessible for studies. And we think that the specification of these primordial germ cells probably occurs around day 17 of development, when we can't really study them. So we have to actually find some other way of trying to get at this question of how the human germ cells are specified. And what we can do is to see if we can use human embryonic stem cells to look at the specification of human primordial germ cells. And that's what we did. We started with human primordial germ cells, and we had a reporter in this. Actually, this was Nanos3 tomato reporter in these primordial germ cells, in these human embryonic stem cells. And we were trying to make these from human embryonic stem cells. But we decided to compare anything we made in culture with the authentic germ cells, which we can get from aborted fetuses from around the 4th week of development, to see if what we were making in culture was similar to what we were making in culture. So this is the diagram which shows you the actual experiment that we did. So we took these human pluripotent stem cells, and using a variety of signaling molecules, we decided to drive them towards gastrulation, towards mesendoderm. We tested these cells at intervals of 6 hours to see at what point in their journey towards mesendoderm they become competent for germ cell fate. And this we can test by exposing these cells to BMP2, which is the main signal you need for converting these cells to primordial germ cells. And we found that at midway, so this takes 24 hours, so around 12 hours in this process, they transiently become competent for germ cell fate. As you can see here, for example, this expression of this reporter, when they start to express this. And one of the key surprises we had was that this gene, SOX17, which is actually important for the specification of definitive endoderm, is actually important for the specification of human primordial germ cells. It's not important for the mouse. So this was a big surprise and tells you that you cannot extrapolate in all cases from the studies in mice. And so we've done lots of studies on these specified germ cells, but in the end what we found was that the two genes that actually which are important for the specification of human primordial germ cells are SOX17 and BLIMP1. These are the two genes which are absolutely essential for making human primordial germ cells. We've done a number of studies where we tested singly and in different combinations the genes to find out genes that are vital for the specification of human primordial germ cells. And it turns out that SOX17 and BLIMP1 are necessary and sufficient for this particular cell fate decision. And here is the experiment that shows that if you express in the in the competent cell these two transcription factors, you can make very large numbers of human primordial germ cells. This is in the absence of any cytokine, so you don't need any signals. The transcription factors are sufficient to make the primordial germ cells. There are certain other conditions you need. The gene dosage is very important, which I won't go into, but essentially you can make human primordial germ cells with these two transcription factors. So the next phase of research which is ongoing currently is to try and figure out in more detail how mechanistically these two transcription factors actually induce this germ cell fate. So what we've been doing is to look at the targets of these two factors, SOX17 and BLIMP1. And the first thing to point out is that what we find is that the targets of the two genes are not the same. So if you look at this plot here, you can see that BLIMP1 binds to different targets by and large compared to the SOX17. It binds to different genes. So these two genes are essential, but they're not. The targets are not similar. And to summarize a lot of work that we have done and the work that is ongoing is that SOX17 seems to be important for driving or upregulating germ cell genes. BLIMP1, on the other hand, is important for repressing the somatic genes. So they work in combination. So one SOX17 is upregulating the germ cell program, and BLIMP1 is suppressing the somatic program. So they work in combination. It turns out that BLIMP1 itself is a target of SOX17. So you can see here, SOX17 is binding to one of the upstream regions, which we think is one of the enhancers, as well as the promoter of SOX17. So it's binding to two different sites. And so we wanted to ask whether this binding is essential for upregulation of SOX17. So we did this, we cloned these two fragments, and we did what's called a luciferase assay. We hooked up these two regions to a reporter, to luciferase reporter. And what we find is that if there's no SOX17, you don't detect expression of luciferase. But in the presence of SOX17, you get a very strong signal of SOX17. So this tells us that indeed SOX17 has the potential to upregulate BLIMP1. We have actually introduced mutations in the SOX17 motifs, both in the enhancer region and in the promoter region. And what we find is that if you have mutation, if you just take the mutation in the enhancer region, or putative enhancer region, we get a slight reduction in the expression of luciferase. So it means that there is some activity in this upstream region. But the bigger impact of the mutation in the SOX17 motif is when you have the mutation in the promoter region. And if you have mutation in both of them, you get very little luciferase activity. So it means that these two regions in the SOX17 locus is where the BLIMP1 locus is where the SOX17 binds and is responsible for the upregulation of BLIMP1. And so what we think is that there are other germ cell genes which also probably work in a similar fashion. So the SOX17 binding to some of these regions, either in the promoter or the upstream enhancer region, will be upregulating the germ cell genes. So this is still ongoing, and we are working through this. We have done the motif analysis for SOX17 and the upregulation of germ cell genes. And the first thing that is that the SOX17 motif for the upregulation of germ cell genes and for the definitive endoderm, what we find is that there are different factors, cofactors that are binding. So in the case of germ cell genes, it turns out that OCT4 and TFAB2C, or AP2 these are two factors, cofactors, which are very important for upregulating germ cell genes. Whereas for definitive endoderm, there's no involvement of OCT4. You have other factors that are, like FOXA1 is important for upregulation of the definitive endoderm gene. So why this is important is that you have many instances where you will have a transcription factor which will induce two very different cell fates. And here we have an example of one transcription factor which induces germ cell fate, and a little later on will induce a definitive endoderm, two very different cell fate decisions. And this model we have provides us with a great opportunity to understand how a single transcription factor can induce very different cell fates. And so we're doing quite a lot of studies on this particular model that I showed you earlier, which is a very simple two-dimensional model, but it provides us with the opportunity to get into great detail about how cell fate transitions occur and how cell fate decisions are made. So we know that SOX genes actually work in combination with other factors. They don't work by themselves. And the model that we are particularly keen on looking at is how it is that OCT4 is involved in regulating pluripotency in one case, where it combines with SOX2, and another instance where it drives the germ cell program, which it combines with SOX17. So OCT4 works in this instance for the pluripotency program, and then then it swaps the partner, and it partners with SOX17 now to drive the germ cell genes. So this, we think, is a model by which the two major cell fates, the pluripotency and the germ cell fate, might be regulated, where OCT4 is the common partner. So what we have also found is that we have looked at a number of other species, apart from human, monkey, pig, and rabbit, either looking at the embryos themselves or the stem cells. And this model that I've described, we think applies to many other mammals other than humans. So it looks like somehow that the mouse model is the one which is different from the rest of the mammalian species that we have looked at. And so the question is, how has this divergence occurred? And we would like to understand this by getting at deeper into the mechanism of germ cell specification in humans versus the mouse to understand how these differences have come about. Okay, so we are continuing to work on this. Amongst the studies that we are currently undertaking is to see, as in mice, whether we can take these specified germ cells from stem cells, whether we can take them further. We would like to take them as far as week 9 of development, because this is the period over which they undergo this epigenetic reprogramming, and we would like to understand the mechanism involved in this. So that's still ongoing. What we have been doing is to take these ex vivo primordial germ cells from aborted fetuses and looking at these germ cells and trying to study some aspects of epigenetic reprogramming of the human germ cells, early human germ cells. This study is also in progress. We have collected, this is obviously when you are working on human germ cells, this is a slow process. So we've been collecting these primordial germ cells for nearly a year now. We've got all the samples now which are now being sequenced. So what we're doing is to look at not only DNA demethylation, but also looking at a number of important histone modification marks like histone H3, K9 tri-17, K27 tri-17, as well as the DiK9 mark. So there are a number of histone modification marks we're looking at, as well as looking at DNA demethylation. Now, one of the things that I'm now coming to the end of the talk, but what we have been interested in is, you can see here, for example, from this violin plot, is that you see this reduction in DNA methylation, gradual decline, as you see in the mice, as you see in mice. And the DNA methylation levels decline to about 4 or 5%. So again, you see this loss of DNA methylation. Now, there are some loci that are resistant to reprogramming. And we are interested to understand how this particular loci escape DNA demethylation. This is an acutely hypomethylated state. You don't see this in any other place. So the question is, how do they escape this acute DNA demethylation? So that's one thing that we would like to understand, which we have some ideas about how this might be working, but we don't yet have all the data. The other thing that we have been looking at is to look at the loci that actually escape DNA demethylation. And it turns out that the majority of these loci that escape DNA demethylation are young hominoid-specific transposable elements. So these are transposable elements which have come in at the time of the evolution of gibbons and thereafter. So they are predominantly made of this very young transposable elements. And when we do bioinformatics analysis of these, bioinformatics analysis suggests that they might be associated with neuronal development. And the genome-wide association studies suggest that there may be implicated some neuronal diseases. So this is just the data coming from just doing the bioinformatics analysis. So we don't really know whether this is important or not, but it is certainly tantalizing, and it is something that we would like to try and explore. And we don't know whether how this will pan out. But so this is something that we are starting to look at. And what we find is that these methylated transposable elements are preferentially conserved in apes. So in other words, they've entered the primate lineage about 20 or 30 million years ago. And so we're doing this kind of analysis currently to try and see whether there is any validity in this idea or not. One of the elements that we've been particularly interested in is this transposable element called LTR12C. What we are basically trying to do, and there are many of these, as you know, and it's quite a difficult problem to get into. So we're trying to find one or two examples to see if this idea that some of these transposable elements might have some kind of a role. And one of the ideas is to see if some of these transposable elements might have been co-opted as regulatory elements. So that's one of the things that we are trying to look at. And what we find is that with LTR12C is that if we look at fetal tissues, 12-week-old fetal tissues, we find that amongst the 2,000 LTR12C loci that are present in the human genome, we do find about 1,200 of them have this histone H3 acetylation mark. So certainly there is a change in the epigenetic signature in some of these loci that are present in the fetal brain. So we're kind of interested to know whether this means anything. This is particularly interesting, and I think it's tractable because this LTR12C is present in humans, but it's not present in macaques. So it provides us with a potential experimental model to look at this particular transposable elements to compare its fate in humans versus macaques, for example. So you can think of this as a gain, as an enhancer or epigenetic gain, which has taken place and may have a role in evolution. That's a kind of a very broad idea, and albeit a very difficult idea. But we would like to test this, and we have some other models that we are trying to develop to see whether these young transposable elements might have contributed to human evolution and development, particularly of the neuronal tissues. So this is, gives you a broad picture. So we start with fertilization, and we do get initial DNA demethylation, which people in the field know about. And then as development progresses, the epiblast cells gain further methylation. And this DNA methylation stays in the somatic tissues. But the cells that become primordial germ cells, you see this decline, this reprogram which we talked about. And you get this loss of DNA methylation and this reprogramming that takes place. And then you get reinitiation of the imprint marks. There are some of these loci which I talked about that are resistant to reprogramming and retain DNA methylation. And whether they have function or not, we don't know. But this is an idea that we would like to test, whether some of these transposable elements, the young transposable elements that have come in, have any role or not. So that's an ongoing subject. So one very final thing is that the other thing that is transmitted by the germline and from the female germline are the mitochondria. They don't come from the paternal germline. They are inherited from the maternal germline. And the model that we have developed, the in vitro model that we have developed, I think provides us with an opportunity to look at some question which we are working with. Patrick Shinnery is an expert on mitochondrial biology. We provide him with the model we have. And what happens during later periods of development is a phenomenon called mitochondrial bottleneck, which means that the number of mitochondria is reduced. The number of mitochondria gets down to the minimum. And it's called the mitochondrial bottleneck. And this is the time when you get segregation and selection of some of the mutations in mitochondria. And so this, for example, shows you that there's a reduction in non-synonymous mitochondrial DNA, mutation in mitochondrial DNA, between the 4th and the 9th week of development. So there is some kind of a process which is going on. The mechanisms are not really well known, but as you know, mitochondrial mutations have so huge implication in human diseases. And so potentially this model might allow us to study how mitochondrial mutations are dealt with. As you know, there is heteroplasmy with respect to mitochondria. So you can have mitochondria which are normal versus those which are mutations. And provided the number of normal mitochondria are more than the mutant ones, then there are no implications for disease. But if the ratio of mutant to normal goes up, then there are disease implications. So this is some work that is ongoing, and I think that the studies that we've started on the human germ cell lineage might provide an opportunity to look at this very important question of mitochondrial disease and inheritance through the maternal germline. So thank you very much. This is my current group. There are many, many people who have gone through the lab, and I mentioned some of them. But I particularly want to thank the Wellcome Trust, who've been funding my work for many years, and some of the others who have contributed to the work, Medical Research Council, BBSRC, and so on, and some of the collaborators that we are very fortunate to work with. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Professor Surani?
Sam.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. That was really great. I have a couple of questions. The first is regarding your methodology. I wondered if you tried, so the methodology to get germ layer cells in a 3D aggregate, did you try that in 2D? And whether you were able to get the same response? And secondly,
Sorry.
No worries.
I was sorry. Can you start?
I will. So, two questions. First of all, regarding your methodology to get germ layer-like cells in 3D aggregates, did you try that in 2D? And if you did not see a similar response in 2D, do you think dimensionality plays a role? And secondly, with regards to that OCT4 SOC17 idea, do you have any comments on what regulates the OCT4 expression in the first place? Is it SOC17 or some sort of other interplay going on there?
Well, I can answer the second question first. The SOC17, we think, is the key gene. It's the one which drives the germ cell program. And what happens is that when you initiate the germ cell specification in this culture, the first thing that happens is that there is repression of SOX2. And this is done by there are two mechanisms. The first is that BMP2 that we use, the cytokine itself will downregulate SOX2. And the second way in which it is downregulated is by BLIMP1. BLIMP1 will also target SOX2 to downregulate. So this seems to be very important early event. And we think that what this does is then it releases OCT4 to partner with SOX17. And that, we think, is the key and essential step. And that happens very quickly at the start of the PGC specification process in human. Now, this is also important because in mice, you don't have the suppression of SOX2, because in mice, you are not using SOX17. So this is a key observation. It says why SOX17 is important in humans, but not in mice, because there are other mechanisms that is operating, which doesn't require the repression of SOX2. And the first question was methodology of... Oh, 2D. We have been trying the 2D. It doesn't work so well. So for some reason, which we are not quite sure about, we need to make this aggregate, 3D kind of aggregate. And this is also the case in mice as well. And we get a better efficiency with the 3D kind of an aggregate. The reason why, we don't really know.
It's divergent. Okay, great, got it. The divergence between the mouse and the other mammalian lineages is quite interesting. And of course, one of the ways that divergence happens in evolutionary space is through mutation of target binding sites and the regulatory elements that are associated perhaps with target genes. And my question is, has anyone really looked at the way that the SOX17 binding sites are distributed? And is it conceivable that at some point during separation of evolutionary lineages, there's been some kind of shift that's been sort of driven by binding site utilization?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. So I think the motif analysis for SOX17 that we've been doing is we just got the data, so we're starting to look at that kind of a question. Why it is that the germ cell genes, because there are genes like NANOC, for example, which are also upregulated in mice, but they are not upregulated by SOX17. There are other mechanisms that must be involved in that. So I think that what we'd like to do is to get better understanding of the molecular detail, the motifs that are involved, in order to get at that question of the divergence. But there's one thing that I think is very striking is that we looked at a number of species now, mammalian species, and it seems that mouse is the odd one out, because all of the other species that we looked at look like the human. And one other thing I think which might be interesting and which we're trying to find ways to look at is to look at marsupials to see how marsupial germ cells are specified. And we are particularly interested in that because marsupial embryos also develop as bilaminar discs, like the human and the rest of the mammalian ones. So it seems that the mouse is the odd one out, also in terms of the embryology so far that amongst the species that we've looked at. So I think it's a combination of embryological studies and some of the molecular studies might actually start to tell us how or why this divergence has occurred. But at the moment, it looks like the mouse is a kind of the outlier in this.
I had a question about the binding motifs that you had shown on one of your slides for SOX17 and how they were different depending on the cell fates, primordial germ cell versus endoderm. And I guess I was wondering, do you have a clear understanding of that mechanism? Is it via direct interaction with Fox, I think it was, or versus another OCT maybe, a direct interactor with SOX17 that would modulate that binding motif or change it? And can you get at that with ChIP-seq or other experimental data?
Yeah, I think it's a very great question. It's something that we are also very interested in, whether there is some kind of direct interaction or some other way in which we find these factors present at the target site. We don't really know. I think that there's a small molecule inhibitor which might actually potentially might inhibit interaction between SOX17 and OCT4. So if that turns out to be the case, we might be able to test that idea to see if the initial interaction between SOX17 and OCT4 is important or not. But currently, that is not a question that we have addressed, but I think this is a very key question. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Surani, for a very fascinating talk. Thank you, and congratulations.
Nice to see you.
You too. My pleasure. I wanted to pass on a message.
Your call will be disconnected.